What I wanted to give you an idea, though, is the kinds of calculus that the black pastors having to deal with that you may not think about as a part of ministering in your church. So hopefully I can get to at least the beginning of discussing the Baptist, the black Baptist in America. This looks just like my church. Oh, goodness, sorry. So, the Baptist. So if you're wondering, well, like, where's the Episcopalians and the Anglicans? Sorry, y'all aren't here because there weren't any black people. I shouldn't say that. Absalom Jones will be yelling at me. Okay. So the white Baptists, as you know, emerged out of the Puritans, convinced of, and I tell this story, and this is important because, like, the black tradition comes out of the white Baptist tradition, so, like, we need to understand where this comes from. Puritans convinced of adult baptism, strong emphasis on separation of church and state. This is really interesting here because this gets shifted. General Baptists were Arminian versus particular Baptists who were Calvinist. The New Lights and the Old Lights, all of these people running around doing Baptist stuff. If you studied the Great Awakening, you know it. Eventually, they began to cooperate on things like mission work. And the National Baptist, beneath this, though, this is the black church Baptist. It's what's called the invisible institution. Have you guys heard this phrase before? The invisible institution. Because we don't know about the actual first black Baptist. Because they went and worshiped under trees, out in the woods. It was the first place where they were able to gather over against the wishes of their masters, their enslavers, and worship God for themselves. The record of that is lost to us. But they didn't just, you understand, they didn't just start churches right after they were free and they became Christians. We just don't know the story. And you can just imagine working all day, at night, because the master would allow, the enslaver would allow preachers to come in and preach them, but you saw the slaves be obedient to your masters. You saw that. But you can see that wasn't the church. So they went and had their own, what they call invisible institutions. They went and they preached to one another and they began to worship God for themselves. Now lost to us. Great testimony. In the woods and in the trees. So we think the first church was the African Baptist or Bluestone Church in Mecklenburg, Virginia. Is there a Virginia in here somewhere? Where's Mecklenburg?
I think it's south where I
Okay. So this is 1758. So this, you got to think about the Civil War is 1861, 65. So you're about 100 years before the Civil War. There is a discussion as to whether or not it was every who's the first is historically disputed. I'm just going to give you these churches' names because I think it's cool to know about them. Silver Bluff Baptist in 1775. So the emergence of the black Baptist is not doctrine, but racism. And we talked about this. The polity made it easy to separate into black churches. So the black Baptists came together. At a certain point, there were Baptists who were parts of white congregations. The white congregations mistreated them. Yes?
Were those churches that you just told us, were those black Baptists?
Those are the first black Baptist churches.
Not white Baptists.
No, those are the black folks. Sorry, I just listed their names. Silver Bluff, and I think it's Bluestone. I'll try to get this to you. I think that's...
Baptists were reasonably well established in
Yeah.
Virginia. Pretty early on.
Yeah, so these are like the first black Baptist churches. So you have, like, once again, the polity. I really want, like, I've talked to our leaders in our denomination about this. If we recognize that the reason for the spontaneous, this is the question you all should ask yourselves. If the reason for the spontaneous expansion of black leadership was by the empowerment of black leaders who were chosen by the community, and our polity hindered that spontaneous expansion, which is just a historical fact. What do you do about that if you're someone who still believes in the importance of bishops, priests, and deacons? I don't know the answer to that question. I do have a couple of solutions, but I can't articulate them now. But like the question of how do you create the spontaneous expansion of indigenous leadership who knows how to reach the community. The exact same thing is true. Sorry, this is, once again, Anglican stuff. The exact same thing is true if you look at what happened with the growth of Anglicanism in the Global South. It was after colonialization ended, black indigenous leadership took over, and the church expands. It's almost like you have to put black people in charge of stuff and trust that we know what we're doing, instead of choosing the person who we think is the most acceptable. What do I know? The distinction though, I talked about this. This is gonna feel like I'm repeating a broken record, but like the repetition is the theology. The difference is there's a strong abolitionist posture in the Black Baptist tradition, and they participated in the Underground Railroad over against white Baptists. Now, here's an amazing thing. So, this is 1758, right? 1770s. Black Baptists participating in the Underground Railroad. You literally go forward 200 years, 1958, 1965. You're in the Civil Rights Movement. The white Baptists in the South and the black Baptists in the South on both sides of the justice issue. You literally fast forward 70 years to right now, 2020. Justice issues. Black Baptist tradition on one side, the largely white evangelical, which is free church tradition on the other side. It's literally the exact same theological fight as it relates to black freedom that has been fought since 1750s. What do I know though? So isn't that kind of like an amazing thing? At least to think about it, to say like, hey, when there's this Underground Railroad thing, we were like, no, don't do that. And we looked back and said, man, we probably should have supported that. Then there was like, oh, well, you could talk about Reconstruction. We skipped that though. Jim Crow, oh, we should have been on the side of like, we're having the exact same kinds of criticisms. Let's pull back. Okay. There's the 1800s in the black context. There were attempts for a national denomination that failed because of race conflicts, and then there's the class conflicts between Southern and Northern blacks, which is another conversation for another day. The North and the South. Everybody started from the South. Everybody got cousins down there. But eventually, the National Baptist Convention was formed. National Baptist Convention USA. In 1915, there were 3 million of them and 20,000 churches. They focused on education. They founded over 100 elementary schools, secondary schools, and colleges. Have you heard of HBCUs? Historically black colleges and universities. A lot of them are founded during this period, not just by the National Baptists, but by all of the Baptists, who once again, taking up the responsibility of educating people in their communities. This is the pastoral responsibility. We had a quote from the Baptist tradition earlier. Booker T. Washington. This is in the South. This is between like the Northern blacks and the Southern blacks. The focus on self-help. This is why you have a lot like, anyone know Tuskegee, like the agricultural schools? Well, the idea is you focus on trade. So even if people don't like you and respect you as a person, if you work with your hands and you work with the trades, you can establish a place in society for yourself. Booker T gets criticized for this because of his focus on like black self-reliance and a lot less push on other issues. But this is a focus of the National Baptist Convention. They did speak out on things like the right to vote, but they were less politically active. This is going to be important later. They're less politically active than some of their cousins. This is the part of the story that's not often told. So the National Baptist Convention USA is politically conservative. J.H. Jackson opposed. This is a myth that like when the Civil Rights Movement started, all the black people said, let's go. Martin Luther King's own denomination did not support his political activity. This is what they said. J.S. Jackson said to King, we need to go from protest to production. We need to go from like marching in the streets to doing things that are, helpful for getting black people economically established. So I talk about the black church not being a monolith. You get to the 1980s, there's a return of social action under Jemison. And today, there are 8.5 million members, roughly a fourth of the black population. Now, this is what I'm going to tell you to do. Don't add up all these numbers of all of these churches and then norm that against the amount of black people in America. Everybody inflates their numbers a little bit. And rather than me adjudicating who's telling the truth, I just put all the numbers down there, okay? So if you say, hold on, I've gotten to 50 million people and there's like 30 million, you know what, you call them, okay? So if you want to call the 7 black denominations and asking who slapped 2 million more people than they should, that's between you and them. You got it? So don't yell at me if this is not accurate. How many people are in your church? Well, if you count Easter. So the National Baptist Convention of America, you may seem like this sounds like really similar to the National Baptist Convention USA, isn't it? Guess why? It was a church split. Now, I'm going to tell, in case there's like members of the Boyd family who turn in, this split is related to the control of the publishing rights to some of the like Sunday school material and curriculum that was owned by, well, depending on who you ask, should the Boyd family control it or not control it? The Boyd family decides that they should control it. Long story short, it's a split over something that we no longer recognize as being super significant. It's similar to like back in the day when people was like, you know what, 2 candles on the altar, I'm out of here. It's kind of like that stuff. We kind of look back and go, okay, you might have overreacted a little bit. The 2 candles on the altar would have been fine. Isn't that the Anglo-Catholic movement? You remember all of this stuff everybody was mad about? And they were just like fighting about it. This is how you get the National Baptist Convention of America and USA. So a fourth of the NBC USA split to 1915, right? So remember the big body that we just talked about, a fourth of them. Now, if you ask the National Baptist Convention of America, the other people left. I think you guys can get this, right? You can get this. We do this, right? So who left who is once again also adjudicated. So don't say to a National Baptist, if he actually remembers, you split off from the National Baptist Convention USA. Today there's about 3.5 million members. 1988, the Boyd family is still at it. The descendants of the Boyds are still in charge of publishing. There's an issue about that again. And they go to the Missionary Baptist Convention USA, which has 1 million members. So the difference between a Missionary Baptist, the National Baptist USA, and the National Baptist Church of America is I've asked people on the ground, there's not a lot of difference. But you should know about it anyway. The Progressive National Baptist Convention, also out of the same family, happens after a failed revolt. Remember J.H. Jackson? So King tries to establish a coup so that he can become president, take over the... By the way, the interesting thing, I think you can read about this in this, I think it's called Parting the Waters, like, where on one level we see Martin Luther King like as this national public figure who's like leading the march for justice, right? You see this guy? He's also effectively fighting like church politics. Like you can imagine like going to General Convention and fighting about stuff. This is King. He's like over in his denomination fighting these like little like ecclesial battles that nobody knows about. So King's over here trying to get the National Baptist Convention USA onto this justice thing that he's talking about, and he's supported by a lot of the younger black clergy. He's trying to get Jackson unseated from his chairmanship, and King, the most well-known black Baptist pastor in America, fails. And they eventually create the National Baptist Convention, Progressive National Baptist Convention, and their statement of like belief, faith, piety, whatever, is unity, service, fellowship, and peace. Interestingly enough about this, though, this group was anti-Vietnam War and invested in the civil rights movement. Today, most of them are dual members in white denominations. So they'll be members of the Progressive National Baptist Convention, and like I don't know what the white Baptist is not, like the general, what's American Baptist. So there'd be an American Baptist and Progressive Baptist. They do a membership. They are about 1.2 million. They claim to be the third largest denomination. Once again, if you start looking at this and you count the numbers, that may not come out, but it was true when they put it on their website. Now, they're mostly in cities. Here's an example. My good friend Charlie is the pastor of Progressive in Chicago, one of the largest black Baptist churches in the city, very politically active, very socially conscious, theologically orthodox. So that's like a stereotypical city Progressive Baptist church versus like a missionary Baptist or missionary Baptist church you might find in Alabama somewhere. So you see them in large cities. And I think at one point he was dual affiliation too, but I want to put that on. I want to put his business in the street. So Baptist polity, they do have them. The structure of the various Baptist groups are similar with national conventions and local conventions. Doctrine varies, so it's independence. There's no doctrinal enforcement, but they're generally traditional in their theology. If you go to a black Baptist church, you will see someone attempting most likely to teach you about the Bible. There's not much national emphasis. And once again, the autonomy can lead to abuses by autocrats, but it's also what makes political activity possible. This is the good and the bad of Baptist polity. There is a tendency to highlight call over credentials. And I didn't realize this was, so here's the thing. It's so weird when you read history. I only have a few minutes. You have to read history and you find out that this is what happened to you. So I go to my pastor. Let me give you an example of this. This is all we have time for. So I go to my pastor, I'm 18 years old. And I say, Pastor, I've been having this sense that maybe God might be calling me to ministry. I'm thinking this is going to begin a long conversation. Seminary, all of this stuff, right? Actually, I didn't know this at the time because I was 18 and I didn't know any other ministers. Pastor says to me, and I forget the number, maybe 6 weeks, 2 months. We're going to give you a trial sermon. Make sure you mention the birth, death, resurrection, and return of Jesus. Meeting over. I know. So I walk out and I was like, and then he says to me a couple of weeks later, like, take this seriously, because Deacon so-and-so over there, he didn't take it seriously, and we flunked him on his first trial sermon. So like, okay. So I go and I preach the trial sermon. And then the congregation goes downstairs, we're upstairs on the second floor. No training. Listen to me. You heard the theological training that I received. Preached the sermon. I went downstairs. They voted, and they said, you get to be a minister. I thought in my head that I was ordained. I didn't realize that I was actually licensed to minister. So I said, listen, I should say licensed. I was licensed to minister locally. They didn't even tell me there was a second level. The reason I know this is because that church had female ministers. And I didn't realize this until much later. And so they had preached trial sermons. And so they thought they were ordained until they started to go somewhere else and like do something else. It's like, oh, no. That license just holds for like basically, I don't know, it's not really a 20-mile radius. I'm just joking around. But like you can like go and talk about Jesus in this little wide context. So I really thought I was ordained a Baptist, and I wasn't. I was just a licensed Baptist, which hurts my soul. So I was not, for a long time I said I was ordained a Baptist before I got ordained in this tradition, but that's not what happened at all. I was merely licensed. And then when the women in the church found out about this and they weren't really ordained, that was a thing. So that's where you get something like the difference between. So there's further examination for wider ordination, which I never actually went to. But by the time it actually came up, I think it's because I had already switched denominations. You can be the pastor versus the minister. Deacons are often lay people. This is the difference between like the Anglican tradition and the like Baptist tradition. Deacons are often lay people and are focused on the general spiritual well-being of the church. The other thing that they don't have in at least white churches that I've seen, like church mothers, like the actual mothers of the church, where there's these women who sit in the front right-hand side and they're dressed often in all white. And they often, the mothers and the deacons together are in charge of the spiritual well-being of the church. I had no idea what a church mother was. I know there's the ladies in the church who sat up in the front on the right who just wore white all of the time, and I thought that was cool. Yes, it's there, but it was like, yeah. So you have other things that y'all might understand, Sunday school, youth, all of this stuff. Now, there's not much space for women's ordination in a lot of the Black Baptist traditions, but the lack of kind of institutional control makes it possible. And what you'll see a lot in Black traditions are other titles. So like they will have like a ministry. So you might see like prophetess so-and-so or evangelist. You hear the title of evangelist. And a lot of times they go and preach in different churches without having like a church of their own. Because to be a Baptist, you just need to be able to plant a church. You do have some women clergy who go and plant churches, but it's not, I would say, the norm in Black churches. They have been involved in missions in early 1821 to Liberia and then to West Africa. So I want you to understand about the Black Baptists as we kind of end, we'll have to end there. We won't get to the Methodists today. Is they are a tradition with their own history, their own internal struggle about the relationship between gospel and justice, their own kind of, what we would kind of consider insignificant splits, which led to different cultures. And you can see these things versus like in kind of what you would call the city Baptist tradition versus the rural Southern Baptist tradition, which has, one of them has a larger focus on kind of self-reliance and independence. And one of the things that's really interesting that I learned from doing this myself is that I actually think that I come from like the Southern like Baptist tradition, not Southern Baptist, but like the Southern like older tradition versus like what happened in like Black cities and places like Chicago. I come from a different stream of the African American Christian tradition. Any questions about the Baptist? I normally let you all out a little bit earlier. I'll try to do better that next time. I'll see you all tomorrow.